set this team up on federal government property, because if they get busted, they want to say we're doing this for the government.
But let me ask you this. Do you think this device, this particle accelerator, was used as a weapon to kill your friend? Or was this an accident?
Well, it's hard to say if the accident was accidental or not. All right? I mean, I call it an industrial accident, but the question is, was it accident or was it sabotage? Right? I think it was sabotage, and I think the actual cause of her arm being burned off was electricity, not radiation. And when we finally found the facility, we discovered that there was a steel wall in one of the rooms, and the steel wall had a heavy steel cable that went out and was buried in the ground. Okay, the purposes of this steel wall was to protect the operators from the radiation that was being generated by the linear particle accelerator. However, when they booby-trapped it, all of the electricity from this 5 million volt machine, 5 million watt machine or whatever it is, went straight back into Mary Sherman's arm and jumped out her back into the steel wall. She was standing in front of the steel wall, which is why the electricity did not go down to her feet. Her feet are fine. It went from the handle that you use to turn on the circuitry up her arm and out the back of her rib cage into this wall. And that is what this was a medical Manhattan Project. This was the most secret thing in American medicine, because they were doing stuff that was dangerous and unethical, and they were doing it for a pretty good reason, but they didn't want to tell anybody, why are we mutating monkey viruses? Because the answer is because we just mass inoculated 100 million of your children with a cancer-causing virus. I mean, you can see how well that would play, you know?
Yeah.
So this facility, and we've got pictures of the facility in the book. I've got all the graphs of the epidemic I was talking about. I got the cancer statistics from NCI in the appendix. We've got the crime scene photos. We've got, you know, a photo of the building. The stuff was in. I mean, that building today, I mean, we're in 2015. That building still has an orange fence around it. Every other 12 buildings on the facility are fine. In fact, they're building new buildings there. But this one building, going back to 1964, still has an orange fence around it after they removed the particle accelerator. But they didn't bother to remove the steel wall and all the weird wiring and all that other stuff. And, you know, I've been to New Orleans, and I've spoken with the homicide detectives, and I've talked to the city council people. And I say, you know, this is the crime scene. You have never investigated the crime scene. You did all the stuff back in Mary Sherman's apartment, but that's just where they dropped the body, because they didn't want to call the ambulances and the fire trucks and everything else to the secret laboratory. They needed to maintain its secrecy, which I find interesting, because I now have a memo from J. Edgar Hoover telling his agents not to investigate the Mary Sherman murder.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this first. Wait,
it's in the book.
Does Mary Sherman have any descendants?
Yeah, she had 2 sisters and some nieces, and I've spoken to them.
Are they interested in uncovering this information or no?
Well, I was happy to tell them that, you know, because the rumor mill said that, oh, Mary Sherman must have been a lesbian, and a lesbian must have broken into her apartment and stabbed her, and that they probably tortured her, and there was heavy drugs found in her blood supply, and she was naked at the my God, you just want to go put your head on the pillow and cry, you know? And I was at least able to tell her family, I said, look, that's not what happened. Mary got electrocuted, and her arm got burned off. And removing clothing and injecting people with morphine is standard procedure for third-degree burns.
Gotcha.
And there's nothing in her apartment that could have possibly burned off her right arm, which is why they didn't tell the public her right arm was burned off. And rib cage. Let's not forget the rib cage. And when you look at the crime scene photos, and again, they're on my website and in the book, you can clearly see the internal organs of her body.
Now, back to this building you were describing with the orange fence around it. Do they give any reason why there's an orange fence around it right now today?
I heard it has asbestos in it.
Okay.
There was I've talked to a number of people who've been in the building. Some of them were contractors. They told me about the wiring. Some of them were people looking to rent the building as a laboratory. They told me about the asbestos. And down on the bottom floor, there is a room that's it looks kind of like an operating room. It's kind of circular. And it has all these little chambers around it. And the chambers are covered floor, ceiling, walls with 1-inch thick asbestos. And from the descriptions I got from the guy who installed the linear particle accelerator, the beam of this thing, it was like a Star Wars kind of beam, but it shoots down at the ground so you don't fry the neighbors, all right? And then right there on the ground, you got this platinum pyramid. Well, it's platinum to reflect the radiation, and it's a pyramid so that you can divide the beam into equal doses to shoot in these various chambers. And in those chambers, this guy says there's no clinical access feature. I mean, there's no ramps or anything for bringing people in there in gurneys or wheelchairs or anything. They've got basically test tubes in these little chambers, and they're doing some kind of vaccine work. Okay? And so that's one of the things you got going on there. And then the FBI shows up at this facility 2 days after the Kennedy assassination looking for Oswald evidence. But they don't bother to talk about that much. But it's in the volumes, Warren Commission volumes. And then what happens with this? Oh, you got some more questions you want to get to before I go on?
Yeah, real quick. One more. It was that you said that David Ferrie was somehow connected up with the Mary Sherman. Now, how do we know that?
Well, I first read that in that Playboy interview in October 1967. Jim Garrison said that to the interviewer. What happens, I'm looking at all this stuff, and in 1995, I finally published a book called Mary, Ferrie, and the Monkey Virus, referring to this claim that Mary Sherman had worked with David Ferrie on this cancer project, and that cancer project involved a monkey virus. And I was, in navigation, there's a term called triangulation. You take 3 azimuths and you're somewhere in the triangle. Well, those were my 3 azimuths. They were Mary Sherman, David Ferrie, and the cancer-causing monkey virus. I didn't know what was in the donut, but I had narrowed it down pretty carefully, that they were doing something really weird. They were giving cancer to animals and people with this cancer-causing monkey virus, which they were exposing to radiation, and they were getting back more and more powerful, deadly viruses. And they killed thousands of mice, and they went through about 100 monkeys. And when they finally got it, they kept working their way up the evolutionary ladder from the mice to the marmosets, which are South American monkeys. And then they started importing African green monkeys and started doing the tests up at the Delta Regional Primate Laboratory. And when all those monkeys were dead, they said, we're now ready to test this on a human. So where do you get a human you can kill and nobody's going to miss? Well, how about death row from Angola Penitentiary in southeast Louisiana? And that's what they do. They have this guy transferred over, and this is a great part of the story. We'll get into this more detail in the second hour. Yeah. But they have him transferred over to this mental hospital, which is essentially a hospital for the criminally insane up there, not far from the penitentiary. And that's where they inject him with all of this. But what happens in 1995,
wait,
I
stop for a
published
second.
this.
How did you stumble on that part of the information?
That's what I'm about to tell you.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a good question then. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So in 1995, I published this book, and mostly just to get the word out to the JFK research community and stuff, and I was hoping that my book would attract enough attention that a real publisher might want to pick it up and stuff like that. And so I went from 95 through 2000 just kind of doing a guerrilla publishing thing, doing it myself. I couldn't afford a real reprint on the bound book, so I started having them photocopied and in batches of 10. But I kept in print. It's the point. I kept at it. And then in the year 2000, my phone rang, and it was 60 Minutes. And they said, interesting book. We got some questions for you. We've been researching this woman who says that she was the lab technician in the laboratory in David Ferrie's apartment that you wrote about. Would you like to talk to us? And 60 Minutes brings me the woman who was working in David Ferrie's apartment with Lee Oswald at her side, developing a biological weapon for the purpose of killing Fidel Castro. And it just so happens, in the weirdest coincidence, you can imagine, that the town that I was living in at the time was her hometown, and I was able to get her backstory. And she was a whiz kid. You know, in the Cold War, they had these whiz kid programs. They were looking for the bright young minds so that we could go beat the Soviets at games and stuff. And this gal started doing cancer experiments when she was in high school. And by the spring of 1961, she was giving cancer to mice in 7 days using sort of a smoke chamber with radiation. And she had been trained by the local head of the American Cancer Society in this little town called Bradenton. And that woman had taught her how to keep records according to official laboratory standards and stuff like that. And just coincidence, that spring, that March of that year, the American Cancer Society decided to have their annual national press briefing in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this gal, who was a senior in high school at the time, decides to crash the press briefing armed with her high school press pass. And she gets in there, and, you know, everybody in the room's a 50-year-old guy in a baggy gray suit, and there's this one pretty teenager in there, and they say, who is she? What's she doing here? And they're getting ready to kick her out, and some woman at the head table says, wait a second. There's got to be a reason she's here. You know, let's ask her, okay? And she said, I got this research I need to tell you all about. And they decide to let her stay, and they invite her to lunch, and she sits there at lunch with the head of research of the American Cancer Society, and she shows him her notes and says, I'm giving cancer to mice in 7 days. And he looks at her and says, young lady, are you serious? Nobody is giving cancer to mice in 7 days. I mean, not NCI, you know, nobody, okay? And she says, well, I'm doing it, and my laboratory's about half hour from here, and if you want to come see it, I'll show you my lab and show you everything. And so this guy goes and picks up the telephone and calls Alton Oshner and says, Alton, get down here. There's somebody I need you to meet. And Alton Oshner shows up in 2 days, and he's got this other old guy in a baggy gray suit with him. And the three of them, that's Dr. Deal from the American Cancer Society, Alton Oshner, president of the American Cancer Society, or at least former president at that point in time, and this third guy get in the car with Judy and drive back to her high school, and she shows them the laboratory. And they look through her notes, and I'm saying, Judy, who's the third guy? She said, oh, his name was Urey, and he was from the University of Chicago. Well, that's Harold Urey. He ran war sciences at Columbia during World War II. I mean, he's the heaviest guy in American science, right?
Wait, and this high school kid had her
He's
own
the guy
lab?
that brings Oppenheimer into the bomb project.
You know, we got to take a break, but my question to you is, this was a high school kid that had her own lab?
That's right. And
okay.
I've got all the newspaper articles about it.
Okay, we got to take a break. We'll be right back after this with more of Ed Haslam, Dr. Mary's Monkey.